My name is Chad Spoon, and I am the Communications and Partnership Manager at ALR. I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. This will be a series of web forums that Actively in Research will hold over the next few months dealing with important issues that researchers face when studying physical activity in the built environment. Before we start our presentations today, I wanted to review a few housekeeping items to let you know how to participate in today's session. Here is a screenshot to show you an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your computer desktop in the upper right-hand corner. By default, you are listening to the webinar through your computer speaker system. This means if you can hear music through your computer, you'd be able to hear the presentations. If you would like to listen to through your phone, just locate the audio pane and select telephone. The dial-in information and access code will then be displayed. All lines have been muted, but you have the ability to ask questions using the questions pane. Simply type in your question and click send. At the end of the presentations, we will do a Q&A and take as many questions as we have time for. I wanted to start with a brief overview of Actively in Research. We are a program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that uses evidence to prevent childhood obesity and creates active communities, especially among youth in low-income and minority communities, which are at highest risk for childhood obesity. We focus on the translation and dissemination of research to inform policy debates and guide the development of effective solutions. Our website has a library of research briefs, infographics, presentations, tools and measures that you can use to make the case for healthy schools and communities. Our mission is to partner with stakeholders to apply the lessons of research to build great communities. And we invite everyone on the line to reach out to us, follow us via our Facebook pages and Twitter account, and sign up for our mailing newsletter as we regularly send out new research on a number of physical activity related topics. So now let's meet today's presenters. We have two experts in systematic observation, and we're really happy to have them on the line and sharing their expertise with us. First, we'll hear from Monica Lounsbury. Dr. Lounsbury is the Vice Provost for Faculty, Policy, and Research at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She has been the principal investigator, designer, and observer trainer of numerous physical activity studies using SOFIT, SOPLAY, and SOPARC in schools and community parks. Monica is going to discuss with us the importance of physical activity in schools and general considerations for doing systematic observation. Second, we'll hear from Tom McKenzie. Dr. McKenzie is Emeritus Professor of Exercise and Nutritional Sciences at San Diego State University. He has authored or co-authored over 200 scientific papers and led the development of numerous physical activity observation systems, including the ones that we'll be discussing today. Tom is going to be speaking on the specifics of using SOFIT and SOPLAY. So with that, we're going to switch it over to our first presenter, Monica Lounsbury. All right, Monica, you're up.
Okay, thanks a lot, Chad. I really appreciate that. Okay, so to get started, we're going to go over some of our webinar goals, and we're going to start by discussing the relevance of direct observation in assessing physical activity and its contexts in schools. Next, I'm going to highlight some of the direct observation research consideration, and then Tom is going to review two direct observation systems that are widely used in schools, and that will be focused around SOFIT and SOPLAY, which I'm sure many of the folks who are on the webinar today have heard about. So to start, a little background on schools. I think a lot of people probably recognize that schools are very important locations for us to understand physical activity. By and large, they have a lot of students that are there, and they're there for a significant proportion of the waking day. They're there for 9 months. They're there for as many as 13 years. And not to also exclude the faculty and staff that are there as well. So we have a good portion of the nation's population that spend a good chunk of time in schools. And so really what happens in schools over time matters, and it matters a lot for public health. And there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to address public health goals in school environments. But I do want to be clear that sometimes as a researcher it can be very difficult to access schools, and that's because schools are really inundated with people who want things from them, and time is a very precious resource in our nation's schools. And they're very reluctant to let you know, anything that's not directly related to their priorities be intrusive to their instructors or teachers' time, or even their students' time away from the curriculum. So knowing that, it's very important that researchers who care about physical activity think about what school priorities really are, and the barriers to really gaining access are really need to be overcome by making sure that the data that we collect are relevant to them. From that standpoint, I have found that there is great interest on the part of schools and school leaders to know more about the effectiveness of their programs, and they also want to know more about the utilization of their facilities. And this evaluation is very valuable to schools because it allows them something to address. And so that's really important. And I feel like systematic observation has also the potential for being very unobtrusive as well. So it doesn't require a lot of time on the part of the teacher or the student to conduct these kinds of studies. So that's another very appealing part. So systematic observation addresses the issue about being unobtrusive, and it also provides data that schools really care about, and that's through the program and environmental evaluation. So a little bit about systematic observation now. So you should understand that systematic observation is not a tool per se, but it is instead a method for assessing any observable behaviors in any context, really. And for those of us who are on this webinar, the behavior that we're mostly interested in is physical activity. But what's really appealing about systematic observation is that it allows us to understand physical activity and the context in which it occurs. Because oftentimes other objective measures do not allow us to understand who was present, what was going on, and these things are very important for us to know if we're going to develop interventions that are designed to improve physical activity. So that's a really important advantage of systematic observation. And SOFIT and SOPLAY are systematic observation instruments, and they assess physical activity in schools. And the physical activity codes that are in SOFIT and SOPLAY have been validated, and I think Tom is going to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll share some resources of where you can take a look at some of that research. But they're very, I think this creates wide appeal for these two instruments in schools because it allows us to use the direct observation that gives us this context, but it also allows us to validly assess physical activity in this environment in a very unobtrusive way. So observation techniques in systematic observation really range depending on what you want to know. They're designed to give us information about the frequency with which behaviors occur, the duration, including the latency with which they occur, and then there's also some shortcuts to get to recording duration known as time sampling or interval recording methods. And there are three of them really that you should know about. One is momentary time sampling, which is at the end of a specified interval, and an interval is a predetermined length of time. And in SOFIT, Tom will talk a little bit about the 10-second observe and the 10-second record mode that is within SOFIT. But that is the defined period of the interval. So at the end of the interval, the observer would record the behaviors that were observed at that moment in time. And doing that over with a short duration of intervals gives us a nice snapshot and a probe in the environment to understand what's happening. And over the course of a 50-minute lesson, we get a pretty good understanding or a pretty good representation of the approximate time things took. So that's what momentary time sampling is. Partial interval recording is collected when in that specified predetermined interval time that the behavior occurs during any of the time, and then whole interval recording is when the behavior occurs during the whole time. And it's mostly conducive to things that are better measured by duration, for example, running. Systematic observation advantages are that it's a direct and objective measure. It assesses contextual variables, as we've talked about. Again, there's low participant burden, meaning that we're not requiring people to fill out forms or to be interviewed. And it's suitable to use in aquatic environments, whereas things like accelerometers or pedometers are not easily used in aquatic environments because we can't put these things in water. The other thing I really want to emphasize with systematic observation is that the results are very simple and they're understood well by practitioners. So the translation of this kind of research, I think, has great potential. There's some disadvantages that I want to talk about, though, and that can be really rolled up in the expense of observer time, because observers are going to have to be trained, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that training entails, but also we have to factor in the time for data entry and for travel to and from the environments where data are being collected. So it's not just the time for collecting the data. And then there's the piece about systematic observation requires observation and access to observing the environment. And so there are places where we're not allowed to go, and in school environments that would include locker rooms and other places where observers ought not go. Then the other challenge that we need to overcome with systematic observation is the potential for subject reactivity, which means that when there is an observer present and they look official and they have a clipboard, that people have a tendency to react to that and behave a little bit differently than they normally would. And some things that we advise people to do is to try to extinguish the novelty by having people be present for a period of time prior to the actual beginning of the study so that we minimize the potential for subject reactivity. I want to talk a little bit about the feasibility of systematic observation as well. I already alluded to the fact that it requires that we have observers and that those observers are trained. And the training and the time for training really ranges depending on how complex the actual system that you're using is. And what makes the system more complex is the number of activity and contextual codes. And so this is really something to consider if you're beginning to develop your own systematic observation instrument, or something that you're thinking of, if you're wanting to modify existing instrumentation. You want to consider the time it's going to take to train folks up. So you're going to want to factor that into the resources you have for your study and the time that you have for your study. Time for measurement, I think, is also important. We talked about the real time plus travel to the environment, the fact that most of the time people who are direct observers also have responsibility for data entry. And if you're using a video, you're going to have to actually go out to the space, record the environment on video, come back, download the video, and then collect the data. So there's extra time that is really factored into that if you use that. I want to talk a little bit about what observer training entails. The first part of observer training really is to memorize the codes. And prior to that, we really need to have operational definitions for each one of the behavioral categories that are within the system. And if you're not familiar, on the Active Living Research website, you can find the protocols for both SOFIT and SOPLAY that we'll be talking about. Within those protocols, you'll find the operational definitions for all the behavioral categories that are within each of these systems. So the first step in training would be to get your observers to memorize those codes and to ask questions about them so that they are well defined and they are distinguished between the other codes that are within the system or other things that aren't included in the system. So the way that you get folks to be able to do that is you have directed practice first using video segments, and there are some tools for that which I'll talk about. And then you're going to want to have a gold standard video that has been assessed with someone who is a certified assessor who provides basically the answers to each one of those to the systematic observation instrument category codes for each one of the intervals if you're using interval recording, so that assessors who are being trained can have their data compared with the gold standard. And once people are at least 80% reliable, then we believe that they are pretty reliable and they can be trained. But we also want to not only use our gold standard video practice, but we also want to use field practice so that people get live environment practice, and they also do that live environment practice using with a reliability check with a certified assessor. So you're actually doing inter-observer agreement checks along with the field assessment. And once you have, again, 80% reliability, we have reliable observers who we believe are trained. But I also need to tell you that training should happen throughout your study, and it's important to assess inter-observer agreement at the beginning of your study. And if the agreement is low, you're going to want to do retraining, and you're going to want to gauge how much training you need throughout your study based on the data that you're collecting. So it's so important that as you collect data, you're also doing that inter-observer agreement, and you're analyzing those data, and you're making decisions about how frequently you need to do it. I want to talk about some observer training tools that are available. We have some wonderful videotapes, and those of us who are in systematic observation know how hard it is to create these kinds of training tools. So these are wonderful. I hope that you'll access them. But they're already available. They include definitions and examples for each variable that are in SOFIT and SOPLAY. There's samples for practice coding, and there's samples for initial observer assessment, and then samples for recalibration, which is really what you need in order to run your study very effectively, making sure that your observers are initially trained well and they're trained up throughout the duration of your study. So important thing to know. And you can get these from Active Living Research, and they're also available through the resource list that we will make sure that you're aware of. It should be on the ALR website in a PDF form. So using video for data collection is something that people often ask us about, and there are some things to consider. It's possible to use video, but there are some limitations for using video, and some of these challenges really are human subjects considerations, because when you are making a permanent record of behaviors that occur within an environment, now you have another degree of challenge or sensitivity for human subjects research, and that's one of the things to consider. It will be next to impossible to do these kinds of studies without informed consent of the parent or youth assent, whereas if you have live data recording, then these things would probably not be likely, since we're not interested in the individual. The data are not usually assessed at the individual level. You also have, when you introduce a videotape or a video camera into the environment, increased subject reactivity, more so than maybe you would with someone with a clipboard. And that's something that you'll want to factor into your study, giving time for the novelty of that to wear off. And of course, there's increased costs, because we already alluded to the additional time that would be necessary. And it's important to avoid mixing live and video data. General planning, IRB considerations, individual students are typically not identified, so usually it's not required for SOPLAY or SOFIT that student assent and parent written consent is not usually required. And then general planning, how many observations are enough? A lot of people do ask us this question, and really the answer is it depends. The more the better, and you should consider the generalizability of your data. So it depends on the nature of your question, but the more data that you can get, the better. And understand that if you're talking about physical education or you're addressing physical education, that lesson units change, and that does have an impact on how much physical activity. So you're going to want to try to probe really what typifies physical education, and not necessarily what typifies that unit, if that's not your question. The adequacy of the sample is the representativeness. So thinking about enough schools, enough lessons, enough teachers, and enough students. These are all things for you to consider and weigh to make sure that you have a representative sample that is directly reflective of your research question. And again, as I alluded to, the diversity of the subject matter is important as well. And seasonality, day and time of week, if you're outside, of course, and then the week and the time of day, I think is really important as well, because kids behave differently over the course of the day and depending on the day of the week. So with that, we're going to, I really want to introduce a little bit about systematic, or the SOFIT and SOPLAY. So SOFIT is System of Observing Fitness Instruction Time, and this is really for assessing PE lessons. And in the SOFIT, we can assess student physical activity, lesson context, and teacher behaviors. And then, of course, in System for Observing Play and Leisure Activity in Youth, it's really a great instrument for assessing school environments, and particularly as it relates to use and physical activity.
Okay, thank you, Monica. We had one question that came in that I thought that would be good while we're switching for a quick answer. It was related, something you said, why is it not great for mixing live and video data?
Well, the main reason for not mixing live and video data is that the data will be collected, no doubt it will be collected differently, because you have the opportunity to stop the video and you have the opportunity to make a different determination than you would if you were trained up. So we highly recommend that you not mix these two protocols. Tom, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, another challenge is that you see things differently, and you get a two-dimensional rather than a three-dimensional vision of what's going on. So that's a possibility for not doing it.
Great. Well, thank you both for following up with that. Now I think we're going to move to Tom's presentation. He's going to be talking to us on the specifics of using a SOFIT and SOPLAY. So Tom, it's your turn.
Thank you very much. I'm waiting for my slides to appear. In any case, what Monica talked about was different observation techniques. And these are put together to create an observation system. And systems are designed for specific purposes. And they have ingredients such as behavior categories, the protocols, for example, how do you pace the observations, and any coding conventions, which are notes that one makes so that if that event is seen again, it'll be recorded the same way it was the first time. Now, SOFIT and SOPLAY are just two examples of observation systems. There are many others, and we chose to talk about those today because they've been around for a long time, and they have established validity, and the training materials are readily available. Also, since they've been around for so long and used in different countries, etc., it allows for generalization and comparisons of data that might be collected in different environments. So you certainly don't have to use SOFIT or SOPLAY. There are lots of other ones, but make certain that it's you validate your instrumentation that you're doing, particularly the physical activity ones. With SOFIT and SOPLAY, we look at student activities primarily relative to their posture. Are they lying down, sitting, standing, walking, or engaging in vigorous physical activity? Now, these activity levels are controlled very much upon the lesson context. That is, how is physical education being delivered? And those characteristics on your screen are very similar to whether the lesson includes basketball, or whether it's even a sport context or a dance context, etc. So it would be management, main focus is knowledge, physical fitness, skill drilling, gameplay, or other. Another important feature that we attempt to assess using SOFIT is what is the instructor doing, and there are various categories for doing this one. The one this morning is directly related to physical activity and whether or not the instructor prompts or promotes physical activity inside of class or outside of class. There are other systems and behavior categories. Now, lesson context looks at how time is delivered to students. It's 50% of the students plus one, essentially, because students in class can be in different contexts. but you'd only get so many codes to be able to identify. So that's how we do that particular one. And also, on your screen now ought to be a sample data entry form. And you can see from the left column, these are the intervals, and then the activity codes from 1 through 5, with 5 being vigorous, the lesson context, and then the right column is teacher behavior or teacher prompts for in class, out of class, or no activity prompts, etc. So score would be made for interval 1, and then it would be made for interval 2. Now, the pacing, audio pacing tapes are available free on the website as well. So people do not necessarily have to make those up. They can be quite burdensome. It is also possible to assess these characteristics using duration recording, but that would require each key being a toggle switch, so you could turn it on and turn it off. And that becomes rather cumbersome if you're looking at something in addition to physical activity. SOFIT uses 10-second observe, 10-second record intervals, and these can be paced by an audio file or a video file. And long ago, we used to use audio cassette tapes, but now people are using MP3s, their smartphones, etc. There are other ways of entering data. We have computer apps. We've done hand scoring with different forms, and we have also used scantrons. And so data entry has changed over the 28 years that SOFIT has been around. This visual gives you an example of how physical activity and the lesson context interval works. With the first 10 seconds is an observe interval, and at the very end, that is where the decision is made. And this allows momentary time sampling so that you can look at both the frequency of the behavior in terms of minutes, as well as the percent of intervals that are recording. And so that's an example of momentary time sampling. Teacher behavior is quite different in that teacher behavior is not a continuous event in terms of prompting for physical activity or reinforcing it. It may occur at brief moments, such as demonstrated on the screen there. And in order to assess whether a prompt had occurred, we're using partial interval recording. So it would be recorded if it occurs at any time during the observe interval. This shortens the analysis possibility, is that you can't then assess amounts of time using teacher behavior, but you can only assess the number of intervals in which it happened to occur. So you can use percentages of intervals as an outcome variable. Now, one of the good things that Monica referred to was that SOFIT and SOPLAY activity codes have been validated in many, many different ways, including heart rate monitors, accelerometers, and pedometers, in a variety of situations, including young children, older children, adults, persons with disabilities, etc. So those codes have been validated. Here is data from one example that we used early on, and we can look at the energy expenditure score for lying down, sitting, standing, walking, and vigorous. And these are based in kcals per kg per minute. And what this does is allow researchers to use a summary score, but also to help out with concerns relative to obesity and energy expenditure that persons who have information in public health might be of interest. When we use SOPLAY, and I'll describe that in 9 minutes, we combine the energy expenditure scores for lying down, sitting, and standing into a category called sedentary. And the energy expenditure scores of these sedentary categories is just about 1/2 of that from walking and about 1/4 of that from vigorous. So we're able to make these estimations for energy expenditure based upon direct observation. Again, these are estimated energy expenditure scores in terms of kcals per kg per minute. And so the summary score, which again is a variable of interest in public health, refers to the amount of time or the amount of intervals multiplied by those kcals per kg per minute for that particular category. As well, we can then sum those and have a total energy expenditure of kcal per kg, as long as you know the lesson length. For example, it might be the total energy expenditure is the energy expenditure rate multiplied by the lesson minutes. And an example given down at the bottom is a lesson might have 3 cals per kg per minute. Of course, you need to know the sum of the weight of your students in class or individuals in class. So this visual provides an example of the typical SOFIT dependent variables. Again, lesson length, and that's the actual lesson length, is very important. It's typically only about 78% of schedule length. In the sample, it's a 34.3 minutes. So we can determine with the units for lying down, sitting, standing, walking, and vigorous, both the number of minutes allocated to that variable as well as the percent of lesson time. Many people sum walking and vigorous to have a characteristic called moderate to vigorous physical activity, and that's summed in the light blue that's there. And then down at the far bottom is the example for energy expenditure rate of the lesson, and then the total expenditure rate for this particular sample. We get to be able to do the same types of analysis when we use the context variables. So we can have the minutes of physical activity or the proportion of lesson time. And those particular examples are there. For example, in terms of management, in this example, it took 9.3 minutes to manage the class, which was about 27% of the allocated lesson time, which is quite substantial. Towards the lower part of the visual is an example for teacher behavior in which the in-class physical activity prompts are expressed in terms of intervals. Again, we can't do the minutes for that because a prompt for physical activity such as go, go, go will not occur throughout the entire interval. Again, I mentioned that there are some alternative teacher behavior codes, and these are identified in the protocols which are available free on the Active Living Research Center. So in terms of data analysis, it's possible to use a basic analysis using the lesson summary scores in which the columns would be added, and you can get number of minutes and the proportion there. To get an advanced analysis, it's important to enter the data interval by interval, and you can then assess them by line. So very quickly, this visual shows one example of the permitting the accessing of the minutes and percent physical activity by the context variables, both by percent of lesson down at the bottom and by the minutes of average for that particular lesson or group of lessons. This was 340 lessons. You can also use the lesson summary scores to look at the effects of intervals. And here is our MSPAN project presented in terms of minutes. So you can see a change of about 2.5 minutes from baseline to year 2. Again, this is only the summary scores. And here's the summary scores expressed in terms of percent moderate to vigorous physical activity that we did in a CATCH project over a 9-year period. I want to point out the important things here is in the need to train assessors very, very well, because the data collectors at the end of 9-year study are not likely to be those in the beginning. So we've used lesson summary scores because we're losing that single variable of percent moderate to vigorous physical activity. However, if you want more complex interactions, it's important to do the line-by-line data entry. And this is illustrated here, which is the portion of percent of time in moderate to vigorous physical activity doing the various lesson context, showing here that students were most active during fitness allocations and certainly least active when they were in a knowledge context. So reliabilities, as Monica mentioned, it's important to do them. And when those are done, independent observers code the same students simultaneously. Ideally, a calculation interval by interval is the way that it's done, and especially during training, because you can look within a 10-second interval to see the agreement. However, some people do the summary scores, but again, as Monica mentioned, it's important to start reliability measures immediately and spread them over the study. And when reporting reliabilities in manuscripts, you should report for each level of analysis. But some people only report overall scores, and these tend to be higher than the interval by interval scores. And as data people, you know, there's kappa scores which adjust for chance, etc. So there are many ways to present reliability of data. So that was the end of SOFIT, and we have just a little time today. Next is about SOPLAY. And SOPLAY is about observing spaces, and it's who comes into those spaces. And in free play settings in schools, people come into spaces at different times and they leave. So what we're doing in these spaces is assessing momentarily. And the notion is, if we have a space, will people come there? And if they do come, will they be active? So a good way to promote people to be active at recess is to make sure that they come, and then we can assess their activity levels there. And in this particular environment with SOPLAY, the target area provides a score, not an individual student. And observers scan from left to right and record the activity intensity of each student. And they can also record characteristics of the student, such as his or her gender. These levels have also been validated. And an important thing about SOPLAY is we simultaneously enter relevant environmental characteristics that are associated with physical activity. And this visual shows some of those. SOPLAY 12 years ago was expanded into an instrument called SOPARC, System for Observing Physical Activity in Recreation and Communities. And in that, we added the age categories and the apparent race ethnicity characteristics of individuals. These could also be done in school environments. So we record area user characteristics, their activity levels, primary activity codes, such as they're doing soccer or dance, and then modifiable area characteristics, such as, is the area accessible? Is it usable? Is it equipped? Provided with supervision and provided with organized activities. And then others, a context that people may be interested in is the day of the week, the time of the day, the temperature, etc. So there's lots of characteristics that can be generated through systematic observation. The important thing, however, is that school areas get mapped. And not only can we look at those through Google Maps, for example, and then identify and sequence areas which will be targets will be located. So there is some need to do that. Here's an example from one school with 7 activity areas. Observer would collect data in one area and then move in a business-like manner to the next areas. The analysis can be by area, or they could be summed to identify what's going on in the entire school at that particular time. And it's important to have either mechanical or some other form of counter. In this particular visual, this is a counter for SOPLAY, and it has 2 counters. We have been using the left side for females and the right side for males. And the color-coded keys would be red for sedentary, yellow for walking, and green for vigorous activity, or whoa, slow, and go. And having counters allows the observers to assess the environment without looking down to having to do the count, etc. There are also apps and computers can be used for this. This is an example SOPLAY recording form, and it's important to start your observations at a particular time, and then you can scan the area, and it takes about 0.8 of a second to enter data for any individual using a counter. So on the left side, under start time, it might start at 9 o'clock in the morning. In area 1, record for the condition, accessible, usable, etc. Record for girls that might be in the area, sedentary, walking, or vigorous, the main activity that they might be doing, and then scan again for boys in the area and enter those relevant records, etc. Those data can be then taken and summarized in terms of the number of people who would be sedentary, for example, or the proportion. In the example on the screen, there are about 1,000 students, let's say a middle school. 700 of them, when observed, were sedentary, which means 70% of the students, when observed, were sedentary. Again, we used moderate to vigorous physical activity, which is a sum of those that would be walking and in vigorous. So we've totaled here in this example that combined of the 200 people in moderate activity plus the 100 in vigorous activity meant about 300 students were engaged in moderate to vigorous physical activity, or about 30% of the population, whether this be in recess or an after-school program, etc. We're able to also use summary scores, and the typical way to do that is using MET values. So in this case, we would take those that were sedentary and multiply by 1.5 METs, those that were walking, and use a 3 MET score for moderate, and those that were vigorous by 6 METs. And we use the low MET scores from Ainsworth Compendium. So you can calculate for a particular area or a school at any one observation period the total number of METs. And this allows for a nice index to compare target areas or to compare schools. And I've shown an example of the percent of total school population in activity areas. If we know the number of students in a school, and we know the percent of students who are in the activity areas, we can calculate the proportion that are actually in physical activity areas, as in this visual before school, at lunchtime, and after school. These data are simply by the number of people are there. And since we can scan for boys and girls, we can do those calculations of the total students in a school. And this indicates that there were about 6% of the boys in the school in the area before school, but only about 2% of the girls. So we're seeing here, except for after-school programs, which were interscholastics primarily, that there were a lot more boys than girls in these physical activity target areas. A lot of them were not accessible. We can also take the data and look for comparisons of only those that were in the target area. And in this particular case, this is the percent in moderate to vigorous physical activity. And before school, of the boys that were there, they were active 57% of the time. But of the girls that were in those activity areas, they were only moderately to vigorously active 32% of the time. And you can have similar data analysis for lunchtime and then after school as well. This particular visual indicates how you can summarize for the characteristics of the environment. These we did in Hong Kong. And so you can see with the red bar up top that the activity areas were essentially usable all the time, but they were not necessarily accessible. They could have been locked, for example. And then we also have comparisons of the activity areas that may have had equipment in them, whether the areas were supervised, and whether there were organized activities in them. So this allows us to look at characteristics, and all of these are modifiable either through policies or through programming. It's important, again, to go back to the notion that data need to be reliable. This particular visual indicates that using SOPLAY data, observers can be very reliable. That is, they can agree on what's going on. As an example, for 472 simultaneous visits to activity areas. And the area characteristics are very, very high, starting with accessibility at 98%, etc. People can also agree with the number of people who are actually in areas. And the example there is correlations, and this was by day. But when you look at the smaller increments, such as target areas, it becomes a little lower. So this agreement was 92% for females and 89% for males. And the activity levels in this particular case, agreement was 90%. And for females, and for males, it was 80%. So this is an example of the notion that we need to do reliabilities in both SOFIT and in SOPLAY. So that's the end of my particular presentation.
All right. Thank you, Tom. That was great. We had a question that came in that I thought, while we're switching to Monica to kind of sum it all up for us, that we could that you could briefly respond to, and that is related to is there a theoretical basis for separating male and female counts?
Using SOPLAY, yes, and also using SOFIT. As we saw from the visuals that I presented, in physical activity areas, in those are 24 middle schools, that very often we're getting more males at all age levels that are in physical activity spaces, as well as they are typically more active while they are there. So if we're looking at the concept of gender equity, we may want to then make some changes in terms of an intervention to have more girl-friendly activities, for example, or maybe different kinds of equipment so that might get them to be there. We're very much concerned about promotion, getting people to physical activity areas, as well as engaging them in physical activity while they're there.
Perfect. All right, thank you. Just as a reminder, if you would like to submit a question, please use your question pane in your webinar control panel. So now we're ready to move to our last brief presentation from Monica on the importance of systematic observation relative to school policies. So with that, Monica, please begin.
Okay, so I want to start with just making some comments to provide a recap of some of the things Tom talked about, because I want to make clear that SOFIT and SOPLAY have wide utility in schools, but they are used differently, and it's important for you to come away from this webinar knowing that. So SOFIT assesses instructional lessons, and typically we're referring to physical education, but it can be used for assessing any organized instructional lesson, and we have actually used this to assess on junior ROTC in a recent study. Maybe some of you have seen the paper, that paper in RQES. We modified the SOFIT protocol to fit that environment, but we essentially were able to collect that data using SOFIT because it assesses instructional lessons. You can also use this for before, during, and after school programs that actually have organized lessons as well. So it's not just for physical education, but it's when there is an organized instructional lesson. It does provide time approximations for both physical activity levels and lesson contexts, and what you get from these data are an approximation of the number of minutes and the percentage of the lesson. And depending on whether you're more policy driven, which you want to look at the percentage of the actual scheduled time, or you really want to look at it from a public health standpoint, looking at the actual lesson length, which Tom alluded to is can be as less as 70% of the schedule lesson length. You want to use that as a divisor for the percentage of lesson time. Frequency of teacher behavior prompts. Also, these are teacher behaviors and prompts for in and outside of class physical activity. What really is a rate, or as Tom alluded to, the percentage of intervals. And then it also provides you with a unit of analysis is really at the lesson level. And you can do this across an individual teacher, so looking at multiple lessons within a particular teacher, or multiple teachers. And it really depends on your research question. And this could be across multiple schools as well, with multiple teachers, or with individual teachers across multiple schools. So depending on what you're really after. It can be used to examine aspects of teaching effectiveness, and a lot of people do use SOFIT to try to understand how effective a teacher is if the primary outcome is producing a moderate to vigorous physical activity. And it also provides us with an overview about what goes on in physical education. So as we alluded to before, we sometimes want to make sure that we're capturing a representative sample of what physical education lessons are like, and that means that you might need to look at the diversity of the activities that are provided in physical education. It can be used to assess individual children, although it typically is not, but you can use it. But you would need to modify the protocol, particularly as it relates to tracking the individual child that's of interest to your study. Okay, so then moving on to SOPLAY. SOPLAY is very different in that it assesses the environment and the environment's use and the physical activity that goes on there. And so it's very conducive to using for recess, before, during, and after school programs as well, especially if there's not an instructional lesson going on. It does tell you some great information about the characteristics of the space, the number of people who are in the space, so you know their gender and other characteristics as well, and their activity levels. And I should mention that in broader school projects, PE environments might also be included as part of the SOPLAY protocol. So if you're wanting to look at activity spaces throughout the school day, certainly looking at physical education in the SOPLAY environment is something that might occur as well. And this particular data is important because it can help schools adopt policies and practices to really optimize school facilities and resources. And when you begin talking with school administrators about the kind of data that your study will provide, that's a very important leverage point for gaining access. So I want to just kind of recap my comments by talking a little bit about school-based physical activity and policies. And I think it's so important to really understand that physical activity at school matters a lot. It matters what happens there, and we oftentimes don't have the kind of information that's contextualized to help us really understand where there are opportunities for improvement. So we need to know what goes on there, and we need to optimize physical activity in schools, because those of us who are in this field know that physical activity programs like recess and physical education seem to be always under fire and are always having fewer and fewer time resources and other resources available, and that's very, very difficult, I think, challenge for those people who are in that field. But nonetheless, we need to take a look at the public health implications of some of those measures. So it's important to gain access. It's important to take a look at what's going on there, and through that we can start to understand within what's available in terms of time and other resources how to optimize physical activity in schools. And I just want to end with saying that SOFIT and SOPLAY are really great tools to help accomplish both of these. I want you to know that we alluded to throughout this webinar lots of observation resources that are free. SOFIT and SOPLAY protocols, as I said, are on the Active Living Research website. You would just simply go to the website, type in the search bar, SOFIT or SOPLAY, and you should find right away the pop-up of those protocols. The training videos we talked about are available through iTunes, and here is the link. So I hope that you'll access those. Those of you who've done this before know how time-consuming to develop your own training tools really are. So this is a wonderful, wonderful free asset to researchers. So I hope that you'll access that. There's also an app for SOPLAY called IsoPark, or for iPad from the App Store, and you can download that as well. So hopefully this has been, you know, really a beneficial webinar for you. And I also want to tell you that we do have a PDF of the resources that should be available along with this webinar on the Active Living Research website.
All right. Thank you, Monica, for summarizing and also highlighting where those resources are going to be. And just to reiterate, there is on the webinar website that Amanda Wilson had posted in the chat box, there is a link to the webinar that will be posted on the Active Living Research website. And on that page, we will have, there already is posted a PDF of a number of SOFIT and SOPLAY resources, many of the ones that Monica just mentioned. So with that, I think it's a good time to open up for the discussion and question portion of our webinar. As a reminder, we submit your questions or comments for the speakers via the question function. And one thing to remember, if we're unable to get to your question today on the webinar, feel free. We're copying and pasting and writing down the questions that we don't get to. And if we don't get it to as well, if you have another one that comes up, email us after the webinar at alr@ucsd.edu. And our plan is to compile them and kind of post an FAQ of all the questions to the Active Living Research website on the webinar page. So with that, we had a lot of questions come in while our presenters were speaking. And I think a quick one that will be easy to answer that's been there for a while is, are there any upcoming opportunities in the summer of 2015 to get trained to be a SOPLAY certified observer?
This is Tom. I don't know any that are currently available publicly. Most people, when they train their assessors through a grant or something like that, they will, or even a school district, they will have a localized training. So I do not know of any general trainings that are going on. And that's one of the reasons that I made the videos, so at least people can have an overall look of how training is done, and so that there are common experiences for what is going on.
Great, thank you. So this may be a question for either of our presenters. How do you assess race and ethnicity based on the observation? Having observation categories, have they been validated? Categorizing African American, white, Latino participants based on observation seems particularly problematic given the racial diversity of the groups.
I will answer that one because race ethnicity was something that we, or parent race ethnicity, was we put in with the interest of health disparities, and that was prompted by Dr. Deborah Cohen, who was an MD at the RAND Corporation. And so the notion and why we were able to generate funding for that particular project was being able to detect people of different backgrounds who might be using spaces that were public, and that was typically done. That is usually not done in SOPLAY or in schools where the characteristics are already known. Relative to the validity of that, the only way to validate a particular race ethnicity, as far as I can tell, except through self-reports, would be through biopsies, and we have never done that. In training for SOPARK, we do a lot of video and a lot of still picture presentations of people to try to identify that. And then the observers are those who live in the communities of the peoples in which we are observing. So they would be much more capable of detecting those particular characteristics than I would, for example. So that is as intimated here, that is the most challenging one for getting reliable and valid data. Again, the only other way is self-report, and how valid is that?
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I wanted to point out that we have reached our 1 hour time, but I think as long as folks are staying on the webinar, we can we'll spend a few extra minutes answering some of these questions. So for our next question, this may be another question for Tom. Can you compare and correlate data obtained from SOFIT with data received from accelerometers?
Of course you can, and that's been done many, many, many times, including with persons with diverse disabilities. And so it can be done. One of the things, it's been done so often direct observation is used to validate accelerometers. And my preference is to use direct observation because of the ability to get the context. And it also allows an assessment of physical activity in aquatic environments as well as in climbing environments or in, say, gymnastics, for example. And so yes, you can do the correlations. And what's I think is very unusual is people try to continue to do both measures of physical activity, which seems quite redundant to me. So my opinion is if you're doing direct observation using SOFIT or SOPLAY, where the characteristics of physical activity have been validated through accelerometers, through heart rate monitoring, through pedometers, etc., it's not necessary to do it.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next question is related to SOPLAY. Is it a more important component getting an accurate count of the total number of people being active in the setting, or capturing activity levels for a sample of the population that's in the setting?
Well, it depends upon the study or the intervention. If we are in schools and we want to look at the entire population, then you would want to capture the numbers of people who are there. Say it before school, after school, or any program during school. So I would say it's more important to have an overall picture of what's going on. If you're looking at the intensity of physical activity, then primarily you might look at an individual space. For example, what's happening in the gymnasium during basketball practice. You could do that. You could also do that using SOFIT, for example. But generally, in free play type of environments, we want to promote them to get more people there. And when they are there, move them from being sedentary to being at least moderately to vigorously physical activity. Active.
Thank you. So in the presentation, Monica mentioned that one of the resources available is that there is an iSOPARK app. And we've had a couple questions asking if there is an available of a computer-based or app for SOFIT or SOPLAY.
Well, SOPLAY app can be used. Let me do this differently. The SOPARK one is also usable for looking at schools, so that's not a particular problem. And we're using that in 20 communities in North Carolina. So iSOPARK and iSOPLAY would be just the same thing. The challenge is right now there are no good apps for SOFIT. We are working with one group, the same ones that developed our iSOPARK. They're in Porto, Portugal, and hopefully by next fall we will have one that is functioning well. It takes an awfully long time to create apps, and then they need to be tested in many, many different situations.
Yeah, I was just going to add that SOPARK and SOPLAY are the same tool essentially.
Perfect, thank you. One question on SOFIT. Have you validated the context and teachers' physical activity promotion behavior categories?
The answer would be it depends. And what we have done over years in terms of validation, in terms of that, would be to take the primary categories in which physical education, dance, and sports are delivered. And so in terms of validation, yes, it's a lot of face validation done by experts. And we started doing this way back in the 1980s. So the validation for those come from more face validity of how things are developed. So you can look at any instructional environment and categorize it into those particular categories. We used to have different ones. Then we have had to collapse them to be more simple. It reduces training time. It improves on the reliabilities, for example. So we always start out with grand schemes of trying to look at different things. In one of our assessment tools, we had 42 variables. And when you begin to collect data, then you need to revise those, shave them down, become more precise. It takes a long, long time. The categories for teacher promotion of physical activity, whether they promote it inside of class, these are theoretically sound. It can be a prompt or a reinforcer, and those characteristics are identified in the protocols. And to look at prompts for physical activity outside of school, we had to go through, I think we went through over 70 videotapes of lessons to even provide 2 examples in our training tools. Most teachers that I have seen do not prompt physical activity outside of a lesson, and so it's hard to capture. It's hard to capture those. So we've done that again through more of face validity. Monica, you want to comment?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's what I would say. There is no other way to validate those particular categories, and so face validity or construct validity is the only method for doing that, and that has been done. And actually, those behavioral or categories for both the teacher and the context are widely used in other instruments in lesson settings as well. So I think they're pretty universally understood for people who do this kind of work.
Perfect. All right. So I think we've run out of time for our webinar. I will open it up to Tom and Monica if you have any last parting comments or recommendations, something to sum up, and otherwise we'll begin to wrap up.
Well, I'm just pleased that people signed up and participated, and I want to thank Active Living Research for selecting us to be part of this webinar. And I think promoting physical activity in schools is a very, very important way to understand. And I think being able to assess using tools by practitioners is as equally important as it is for people who consider themselves full-time type of researchers. So practitioners ought to be able to identify what's going on in their locations and be able to use these to support their own particular philosophies and programs. So thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Great.
Well, and I would just like to say thanks for having me be a part of this chat. It was certainly my pleasure, and my collaborator Tom McKenzie is world-renowned for this kind of work, so I think the folks who are on the webinar are in very good hands. And I just want to, my final word on this is that knowing is power, and administrators and school leaders need to know more about what goes on in their school environment. And our studies have really shown that oftentimes physical education and other physical activity producing programs are among the least known on the part of administrators, and so being able to provide these kinds of data are so critical to helping us improve them overall. And so I hope that the webinar has helped inspire more people to do this kind of work in their own communities, because local data does matter.
Thank you, and I would like to reiterate our thanks to our speakers today, both to Monica and Tom, for sharing their expertise with us. And we hope that all of our attendees on the webinar are able to apply what you learned in your own research. We wanted to make sure that you're reminded to be sure to check out the resources that are available through the Active Living Research website. And after the webinar, you will be receiving an email with a webinar evaluation, and we would love for you to respond and let us know how today's event went. So this concludes today's webinar. Thank you and have a great day.